Far Cry 3 was a revolutionary open-world first-person shooter released in 2012 and developed by Ubisoft. However, after this landmark game, the Far Cry sequels would begin to emulate what was successful in the third installment. It seems as if the direction of the Far Cry franchise wants to take the template set forth in Far Cry 3 and move forward in that direction. As a result, many people have criticized the Far Cry sequels after 3 for playing it too safe and for not being innovative enough. But with all of that being said, and I know this will be a shocker to none of my regular viewers, I'm a big fan of the Far Cry sequels from 3 to the modern day. Now, I agree that these sequels do follow a very strict formula. However, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. In fact, I actually like that formula, which is why I affectionately refer to the sequels after 3 as the Far Cry Formula games. And I say that lovingly because I love the Far Cry formula. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the Far Cry Formula games, why some people don't enjoy them, and why I absolutely love them.
Stars and stripes!
Hello and welcome to another Carrot Scraps video, and by another, I mean the 98th. So yeah, I love the Far Cry Formula games, which is actually kind of interesting to me because growing up, I didn't really consider myself a big fan of first-person shooters. I would actively tell people that I didn't like that genre of game. And while my favorite genre of video games are still side-scrolling platformers, I've realized over time that I actually like shooters more than I was willing to admit. I think the biggest hang-up for me when admitting that is that I don't really enjoy PvP first-person shooters, but I absolutely adore PvE first-person shooters. I mean, when Doom, Wolfenstein, BioShock, Fallout, and Far Cry are some of my favorite video games ever made, it's time to admit that I don't really hate first-person shooters. That was just something that I said while I was growing up for whatever reason. I'm no longer afraid to admit that I love first-person shooters, and going hand in hand with that, I'm no longer afraid to admit that I love the Far Cry Formula games. But before I talk about why I love these games, let's talk about what the Far Cry Formula actually is. The details that are easy to spot from sequel to sequel, and the aspects of the game that some people don't seem to like upon repeat. So before we get into anything, we have to go over what exactly the Far Cry formula is. What template does it adhere to? Let's go over what at least I identify it as. And the general Far Cry formula starts with story to me. Whoever the protagonist may be finds themselves stranded in a hostile but beautiful landscape. That protagonist is then placed on the opposite side of a distinct, over-the-top, and deadly antagonist. And oftentimes they're so charismatic that they end up being in the majority of promotional material and on the cover of the box instead of the protagonist. When it comes to gameplay, obviously every game is a first-person shooter, but these games are also open-world map games. These kinds of games offer a pretty large illusion of choice to the player. In most ways, the player is encouraged to engage with the game however they want. They can attempt to complete the story as fast as they can, or they can play side missions, explore the world, or they can just spend their time hunting. Generally, the design philosophy around the missions in Far Cry games are quantity over quality. The idea of these games is to have you go from story beat to story beat, but for players to get distracted by a side mission along the way. In recent years and with each new installment, the formula has changed slightly over time. Changes like removing towers that reveal places of interest in the area, or adding multiple sub-antagonists before attacking the main antagonist. But generally speaking, that's the Far Cry formula. So with all of that context out of the way, let's finally get to the main point. Why do I like the Far Cry Formula games? Well, for a couple of reasons. Now let's make one thing clear right off the bat. To me, one of, if not the main focus of the Far Cry Formula games, is exploration. I think developers want people to explore in their games, and that's the thing that I value the most. I like the methods that they've given players to explore their worlds, and I like the worlds that they've created. Now getting into why I like the Far Cry Formula, the first thing I like about the formula is the formula itself. Now, I know that sounds really obvious, but let me explain. By that I mean, I like the methods that the developers have created to explore and interact with their world, and because of that, I'm consistently ready for more. Building a game around exploration with high-quality first-person shooter gunplay that grows with every installment, and a variety of ways to explore the world, is a formula that I think is really well made. I think they've created something really great, and they've improved it with polish over time. And I honestly enjoy exploring a new virtual world in each installment through the lens of this formula. I think another reason why I generally enjoy the Far Cry Formula games is for the similarities that they share with the Bethesda open world games. Open world shooters centered heavily around exploration and completing simple quests. Admittedly, you have less role-playing opportunities and more simple missions, but the similarities are there. I think these Far Cry Formula games fill a need that I have for more open world Bethesda games. I just have a want for more open world first-person exploration games, and Far Cry really scratches that itch. And I'll admit that in my head, I consider the Far Cry Formula games similar similar to games like Fallout 3 and Fallout 4. And I don't think that's a bad thing, it's just a general preference of mine. Moving on, another reason why I love the Far Cry formula is because of the design of its many worlds, in both appearance and environmental design. In a franchise where the means for exploring and interacting with the world have stayed mostly the same, I'm always impressed and satisfied with the playgrounds that they give players to explore. I think every game since 3 looks drastically different from the one before, and that's extremely important, because even though I love the gameplay in these games, I don't think I would enjoy them as much if every installment was set in the same or a similar location. Changing the backdrop is a big part of the formula, but it's also what keeps the formula fresh. Similar to Bethesda-style open-world games, exploring is an important part of the gameplay, and I think the Far Cry Formula games do an outstanding job of giving you an interesting world to explore. I think one of the most interesting things about the Far Cry Formula games is the variety that exists in subject matter and tone. I think the reason for the variety is because the gameplay is so similar between multiple entries. But this aspect of the experience needs to be significantly different to make the game that much more of a compelling investment. Putting aside the main numbered games which feature lush environments, let's go through the other games since Far Cry 3. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon was a satirical 80s neon dragon hunt. Far Cry 5's DLC took us to a gritty Vietnam, a silly alien landscape, and an even more ridiculous meta-zombie story in the form of a movie pitch. Now with the Far Cry 6 DLC, we're seeing a chaotic deep dive into the dreamlike psyches of some of the most prolific antagonists in the series. Then of course we have Far Cry Primal, which brings its players to the dawn of humanity, and on the other side of that spectrum, we have Far Cry New Dawn, which takes you to the post-apocalypse, and a post-apocalypse that looks quite different than other ones that I've seen before. Look, I know that these games are fairly similar when it comes to their gameplay. However, I really do appreciate how different all of these games are when it comes to their other facets, such as story and tone. It's an anthology series that I'll admit flirts with comedy a little bit too much sometimes, but often isn't afraid to take us to bizarre and unique places. I really love that about the Far Cry Formula franchise, and I think that the simplicity of its gameplay allows for variety in other places like this. Lastly, the biggest reason I love the Far Cry formula is because it's comforting. Being honest, it's just relaxing playing a game where I know what to expect in a lot of ways. The controls being so consistent mean that I'll almost always know how to react and behave in any games called Far Cry. These games deliver a very specific experience, and generally speaking, they've delivered every time for me. I like games that break the mold, try new things, and risk their reputation in the pursuit of doing something new. However, I also enjoy games that don't fight my expectations. It's nice to have a well-polished, good game that plays into my expectations. Giving me more of what worked before is nice to me. In addition, I think playing a game like this helps raise my expectations for the next game that's willing to break all the rules and do something new. It makes that hypothetical game more special. I think this also creates a unique role-playing experience where I know how to maneuver in the game so well that responding in it feels like second nature. It's so interesting because these aren't necessarily role-playing games, but I often find myself becoming immersed in a game like Far Cry. The reason is that I'm just so comfortable while playing and so engaged in this type of experience that I'm used to it. And being that comfortable allows me to relax and imagine myself in the location. Essentially, knowing controls enough will become an extension of who I am. But to focus back on my main point, it's just a comforting experience to play something so well made that's so consistent.
Why are you always playing these gun games?
I don't know, I just like these games. Speaking of, I thought somebody like you from the future would be into this kind of Rambo stuff. I feel like pretty much every depiction of the future I've ever seen has like an obsession with guns.
Way too many guns in the future. I gave them up a long time ago. I'm searching for a new weapon now.
Right. Well, I'm pretty sure you're not going to find that just sleeping on my couch every day and eating all my dinosaur chicken nuggets.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, whatever happened to Tiny Marmio? Wasn't that a video game you liked?
You're talking about Mario, right? Like Mario Brothers? That's what you mean?
No. I'm talking about little Tiny Marmio. He was a punter, I think.
You mean like a plumber, not a punter. You're talking about Mario. Seriously, dude, I love Mario Brothers. How do you not know this? You're supposed to be me from the future. I mean, come on. This is easy stuff, even if you're not me from the future. Now, I want to be clear about people who criticize the Far Cry formula. Like I always say, it's a good and important thing to criticize our media, especially in this case where that media begins to present trends. In addition, I think there are very valid criticisms about the Far Cry formula, ones that I don't agree with and some that I do, but criticisms that I think are valid nonetheless. Now, on the other hand, there are definitely people who express criticisms that I don't necessarily think are that pertinent to address, and there are people who express their criticisms, valid or otherwise, in less than constructive ways, preventing them from being heard. From criticisms I consider to be valid, like asking the gameplay to innovate between entries, to opinions that I disagree with more, like insisting the games are awful because of their similarities. And then all the way to the fairly recent but extremely silly criticisms about the franchise being too woke, which maybe I'll talk about in another video because I've seen some really silly takes when it comes to that. But there's an entire spectrum of criticisms to consider, even if I enjoy the franchise. Let's really quickly go over some of the criticisms that I think are most important. In addition, let's talk about changes to the formula that I'd like to see in the future, and that I think could improve the game for fans of the Formula franchise, in addition to people who aren't fans. First of all, while I enjoy the methodical designs of many of the missions in the games, I do think a greater effort could be put into some of these side missions. I want to be clear, I like simple missions in Far Cry. Missions like taking towers in Far Cry 3 and 4, or like taking the border checkpoints in Far Cry 6. These are missions that are mostly the same and they're scattered throughout the map. I like these missions, and I think having simple objectives like these are something that I really enjoy about the game. However, I'd like to see a greater diversity of mission objectives outside of these examples. I think especially for missions that tell a story, whether they're a main story but primarily side stories. Sometimes it feels as if a lot of the missions blur together, and I'd like some of them to stand out, especially in terms of gameplay. Another piece of criticism that I have, or maybe it's more accurate to call it feedback, is about how you interact with the world. Now, I've explained a couple of times now that a big reason why I play these games is because of exploration. However, while I think gunplay has been handled really well in these games, I do think that there could be greater innovation when it comes to how you interact with the world, especially when it comes to exploration. When I think about innovations that I would want, I think about Breath of the Wild. I really feel like the game design in Breath of the Wild is catered to help players explore, and I'd love to see that philosophy included in future Far Cry games. Make physically exploring these worlds just as fun as fighting the people in it. I think the developers could go into a lot of different directions when it comes to this part of the game, and I'd love to see more effort put into this in the future. Anyway, let's move on to my final criticism. Something else is that I'd like to see a greater commitment to the changes that are introduced in the Far Cry formula sequels. For example, I really admire Far Cry Primal for trying something extremely different, especially when it comes to comparing its gameplay with the other sequels. In Far Cry Primal, because the story takes place at the dawn of humanity, you can't use guns, and so the gameplay has a heavy focus on melee combat. There are definitely really cool aspects of Far Cry Primal, like taming animals and the world building. However, I don't think enough attention was given to the gameplay. Melee needed a complete overhaul in my opinion to make it more enjoyable and interesting. Instead, it just came out as basic and frustrating. In addition, I think animal taming could have been expanded upon in really interesting ways. But the combat in Primal could have been built on in a number of different ways, like making the bow and arrow drastically different than the previous games. Now, I have a similar criticism of Far Cry New Dawn. In this game, more RPG mechanics were added that made New Dawn distinct from its predecessors. But again, while interesting and different, I still think the development team could have done a little bit more to make this new change something special. In essence, in the context of the formula, I love seeing the developers try something different, but if they're going to attempt something new, I advise they commit to it and really make it something special and memorable instead of just different. Now, those are just a couple of criticisms that I have, but they're definitely changes that I'd like to see in the future. So yes, I have criticisms of the Far Cry formula, and I definitely respect others who criticize the franchise as well. But even though there are valid criticisms of the franchise, I'm not a fan of the people who are rude or not constructive about their criticism. My point with this video is not to claim that people who criticize the franchise are wrong or to ask them to stop. I agree with many of them. More so, my point is that even while conscious of the shortcomings of the franchise, there are still qualities to be admired in the similarities. I'm saying for people like myself and others, there is a place in the world of video games for a game that doesn't just do what's expected, but does it very well. That was my general goal with this video, and I hope that came across. You know, I don't pretend to understand time travel, but it's interesting that my future self barely remembers this part of my life. Maybe that just means that change is a normal part of life. I'm sure my younger self would judge me for openly enjoying first-person shooters, and now apparently my older self doesn't remember a time when he enjoyed these kinds of games. Either that or he's just very old and has the memory of a very old person. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe I shouldn't read too far into this. The point being that change is okay, whether you're a person or a video game. Of course, I would be happy if the next Far Cry game did something drastically different than the one previously. But I also think that there's something cool about something that's well polished and expected. I like that I can rely on a lot of these Far Cry games to be what I expect them to be when I need to relax. And I think there's room in the world of video games for the Far Cry formula. Anyway, that's gonna do it for this video. If for some reason you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and to subscribe to my channel for more. As regular viewers know, I make a variety of content on my channel, and I'm always gonna make the videos that I wanna make. But if you see something you enjoy, make sure to let me know, and I'll try to prioritize that kind of content in the future. If you wanna watch me play video games live, check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/carrotscraps, and all my other social media, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are at carrotscraps as well. So I wanna thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. And I think there's room in the world of video games for the Far Cry formula. If we get